Part 1: The Setup and Historical Context. In the spring of 1906, in the limestone country west of Leeds, there was a quarry that no longer appeared on company maps. It had been worked hard through the 1880s and 1890s. Its pale stone hauled by cart and later by narrow-gauge rail to supply bridges, mills, and new rows of terraced housing. But by the turn of the century, the upper face had grown unstable. Small collapses became common. In 1904, after a fatal fall of stone that claimed 2 men, the pit was officially closed. By early 1906, the site was considered finished business. The main shaft, known locally as Crewthorne Pit, had been partially backfilled. Timber supports were removed where possible. A heavy iron gate was bolted across the lower access tunnel. The upper drop, a near vertical cut descending some 80 feet into shadow, had been fenced with thick oak rails set in concrete. A notice board warned of unstable ground. The land itself did not look abandoned. It simply looked quiet. To the south, sheep grazed along uneven ridges of spoil. To the north, a cluster of workers' cottages stood within view of the old winding path that once led carts down into the pit. The quarry company still employed a small maintenance crew to inspect the grounds, monthly more to prevent trespassing boys than to preserve the site. Among that crew were 3 men whose names appear repeatedly in parish records and later newspaper columns: Thomas Elwick, age 43, Samuel Rudd, age 38, and a younger man, Arthur Bell, just 21. Elwick had worked the quarry since he was 16. He knew the sound of splitting limestone, the feel of damp dust in his throat, the echo of hammer against chisel. Rudd had joined in the early 1890s and survived the collapse that killed the 2 men in 1904. Bell, the youngest, had never worked the pit during its full operation. He knew it only as a closed wound in the earth. Their task was simple. Each fortnight they inspected the fencing, ensured the gate remained locked, and checked that no one had disturbed the warning signs. The first report of anything unusual does not come from rumor, but from a maintenance log dated April 17, 1906. The entry is brief. Inspected lower gate, bolt intact. No signs of trespass. Noted unusual echo from shaft interior during afternoon round. Possibly wind. The word possibly is underlined. At first, nothing about the pit seemed extraordinary. Old quarries were known for strange acoustics. Wind passing through irregular rock faces can produce tones that resemble distant speech. Settling debris can tumble without warning. Groundwater may drip in hollow chambers, magnifying small sounds into larger impressions. Men who work underground grow accustomed to odd noises. Yet several small details began to unsettle those who passed near Crowthorne Pit that spring. Shepherds reported that their dogs hesitated near the fenced edge, whining and refusing to approach the drop. Children who once dared each other to throw stones into the shaft began avoiding it altogether. One schoolboy later recalled that the sound of his stone striking the bottom took longer than it ought to, though such estimates are unreliable. Still, the quarry remained sealed. On May 2nd, Elwick and Rudd performed their scheduled inspection shortly before dusk. According to Rudd's later statement to a local reporter, the air was unusually still that evening. No wind at all, he said. Not so much as a leaf moving. They checked the upper fencing first. No disturbance. The posts were firm. The warning sign hung straight. When they approached the lower tunnel entrance, the one barred with iron, they noted moisture around the stonework. This was not uncommon. The old drainage channels often wept after heavy rain. What was uncommon, Rudd would later write in a letter to his brother, was the sound that followed. But at that moment, on May 2nd, they did not yet describe it as anything extraordinary. They heard something indistinct. A murmur. Elwick reportedly paused and held up a hand, asking Rudd to remain still. Both men later agreed that what they heard did not resemble falling stone or dripping water. It resembled, in Rudd's careful phrasing, a confusion of low tones, as if several men were speaking at once at a distance. They stood for perhaps half a minute. The iron gate remained bolted. The pit had been sealed for nearly 2 years. No workers were scheduled below ground. No authorized entry had occurred since the closure. The sound faded. Elwick, who had spent more than 2 decades listening to echoes underground, reportedly said only this: "Must be air finding its way." They completed their round and returned to the cottages. That night, according to a short note later found in Arthur Bell's personal journal, Elwick mentioned the noise casually over supper. He did not describe it as voices. He did not use dramatic language. He said the pit was carrying sound, Ali again, but Bell wrote something else beneath that entry, a single line. He said it did not sound empty. In the weeks that followed, no formal complaint was filed. No authorities were contacted. The quarry remained sealed, its iron gate unbroken, its fencing undisturbed. Yet from that evening onward, those who passed near Crowthorne Pit began to listen more carefully, and they would soon begin to hear it again. The second occurrence was not entered into the maintenance log. It was first mentioned in a letter. On May 11, 1906, Arthur Bell wrote to his cousin in Bradford. The letter survives only in fragments, quoted years later, in a parish newsletter. In it, Bell describes an evening inspection conducted by himself and Thomas Elwick shortly after sunset. The air, he wrote, had turned colder than expected for May. A thin mist lay low across the quarry floor, though the surrounding fields were clear. They approached the upper fencing first. Before they reached it, Bell heard what he initially believed to be laughter. He later amended this description. In his words, it was not laughter in the cheerful sense, but a brief rise and fall of sound that carried a human quality. Elwick did not immediately respond. He walked to the fence and leaned slightly over the rail, peering down into the shaft. The drop remained as it always had: sheer limestone walls, streaked darker where moisture gathered, descending into a depth that swallowed light. Bell reported that he felt an odd reluctance to approach the edge. Not fear exactly, more a hesitation. Then the sound came again. This time both men acknowledged it. It was faint, irregular, and layered-like, several voices overlapping in subdued conversation. No single word could be distinguished. No clear direction could be determined. It did not echo in the manner of a shout. It seemed to rise steadily, hold for several seconds, and then subside. Elwick called out, "Is anyone below?" His voice fell cleanly down the shaft, struck stone, and returned as a hollow repetition. The echo behaved normally. There was no reply. They waited. After perhaps 20 seconds, the low murmur resumed. Bell later insisted that the sound did not resemble wind. There was no movement in the grass behind them. The mist at the pit's edge hung still. No draft passed across their faces. Elwick descended the winding path to the lower tunnel entrance. Bell remained above, listening. At the iron gate, Elwick found the bolt untouched. The padlock was secured. He shook the bars to test for looseness. The metal rang sharply against a stone frame. The murmurs ceased at once. Bell described the silence that followed as complete in a manner that pressed upon the ears. Elwick remained at the gate for several minutes. No further sound came from within. The following day, the men attempted to account for what they had heard. Rudd suggested that boys might have gained access through some unseen gap in the rock face, though no such gap had ever been documented. Elwick proposed that the quarry's irregular chambers might be channeling distant farm noise in unexpected ways. It was planting season. Laborers could be working in fields beyond the ridge. To test this theory, they returned the evenings later at approximately the same hour. This time, they brought a lantern. The descent to the lower gate was uneventful. The lantern light revealed nothing beyond the iron bars except the narrow entrance corridor, half filled with rubble as it had been since closure. Beyond that point, the passage bent sharply left and disappeared into darkness. Bell called out first. There was no answer. Rudd struck the iron bars again with a small hammer. The metallic report echoed inward and returned diminished. They stood in silence. At first, nothing. Then slowly the sound gathered. It began as a faint vibration, almost indistinguishable from the settling of distant stone. But it did not fade, as stonefall does. It thickened. It layered. It formed into something unmistakably patterned. Several tones, rising and falling irregularly. Bell later testified that he felt certain the sound was composed of separate voices. Not one, but many. Rudd, when questioned weeks later by a reporter from the Leeds Mercury, was more cautious. He described it only as a confusion of tones that might be mistaken for speech. Elwick did not offer a public statement at that time. He did, however, make a private notation in the maintenance ledger dated May 14. Return to pit at dusk, with SR and a B repeated occurrence of interior sound. No visible trespass. Gate secure. Recommend inspection of interior, if feasible. The final line was later crossed out, and interior inspection was deemed unsafe. The 1904 collapse had left several chambers unstable. Company management in Leeds declined to authorize any descent without significant reinforcement, which they were unwilling to fund for a closed site. Thus the pit remained sealed. Yet word began to travel. 2 shepherd boys claimed to have heard men arguing below the shaft during the midday hours. A woman walking the ridge path reported what she described as singing carried upward from the hollow. She did not return that way again. Each account was slight. Each could be dismissed. But the pattern had begun. The quarry that had once rung with hammer and chisel now produced sound of its own. And for those who knew its emptiness, that was the most difficult fact to reconcile. By late May of 1906, the sounds at Crewthorne Pit were no longer confined to the maintenance crew. They did not occur daily, nor did they follow a predictable hour, but they recurred often enough that the matter ceased to be a private concern among 3 men. On May 23rd, a brief mention appeared in the Leeds Mercury under the column reserved for local curiosities. Reports from the disused Crewthorne Quarry speak of unusual acoustic effects emanating from the sealed shaft. Company officials attribute the phenomenon to wind passing through irregular stonework. The tone was dismissive. Yet the article had been prompted by more than rumor. It followed a visit by a junior company surveyor, Mr. Edwin Hartley, who had been sent to evaluate the situation after repeated entries in the maintenance ledger. Hartley arrived in the afternoon, accompanied by Elwick and Rudd. Arthur Bell remained above with the lantern equipment. The weather that day was unsettled. Low clouds moved quickly overhead, though the air within the quarry bowl felt curiously contained, as though the surrounding limestone walls held it in place. Hartley's written report survives in company archives. His language is measured, practical. He notes no disturbance to the fencing, no evidence of tampering at the lower gate. He records the structural condition of the visible rock face, a scent changed from previous closure assessment. Then, near the bottom of the page, he adds, while stationed at lower entrance at approximately 4:15 p.m., I perceived a sound resembling distant speech. Quality, indistinct. Duration, perhaps 15 seconds. No visible source. Hartley attempted to reproduce the sound by calling into the tunnel and striking the iron bars. The echoes returned cleanly. Nothing abnormal presented itself under deliberate testing, but as the men stood in discussion, the murmur began, again unprompted. Rudd later described it as nearer than before. Not louder in volume, but clearer in structure. There were pauses, he said, as if one voice stopped and another answered. Hartley reportedly turned toward the tunnel interior and listened intently. He did not interrupt. When the sound faded, he stepped forward and pressed his ear between the iron bars, leaning slightly into the opening. He remained there for nearly a minute. In his report, he does not speculate. He simply writes, "Sound ceased upon approach." That detail unsettled the men more than the sound itself. Over the next week, the occurrences increased in frequency. Arthur Bell recorded 3 separate evenings in which the murmur was audible from the upper fence without descending to the gate. On one occasion, he claimed to distinguish what he described as a cadence resembling recitation. He could not make out words, but he insisted the pattern did not resemble random noise. Others began to gather at a distance to listen. Not crowds, no, more than 5 or 6 at a time. A shepherd, 2 boys, a pair of quarry widows who lived in the cottages. They stood well back from the fence, hats in hand, as the sound drifted faintly upward from the sealed shaft. There was disagreement about what was being heard. One man insisted it was merely wind crossing broken stone. Another claimed it resembled men speaking through cloth. A third swore he heard a single clear word, though he could not later recall what that word had been. Notably, the sound was not constant. Some evenings passed in complete silence. On others, it returned twice within the hour. The most troubling incident occurred on May 3rd. Shortly after dusk, Elwick and Rudd approached the lower gate, following reports from two boys who claimed the sound was louder than ever. Arthur Bell remained at the upper fence. The air was heavy, still. As Elwick reached for the gate to test the bolt, the murmur rose abruptly from within the tunnel. No gradual build this time. It was immediate, layered, sustained. Rudd later stated that the sound continued uninterrupted for nearly 40 seconds. Neither man called out. They simply stood. Rudd described a sensation that the voices, if voices they were, had drawn nearer to the entrance. Not physically, closer in measurable distance, but more immediate in presence. Then, as Elwick placed his hand against the iron bars, the sound altered. It thinned, not faded, as if the overlapping tones had narrowed to fewer sources. For a brief moment, Prod would always insist on this point. He believed he heard something distinctly separate from the murmur. A single, low utterance. Not loud. Not clear enough to transcribe. But shaped. Elwick withdrew his hand. The sound stopped at once. They remained at the gate several minutes longer. Nothing followed. That evening, Elwick made the longest entry yet in the maintenance ledger. Repeated interior sound. Pattern irregular but sustained. No sign of intrusion. Recommend temporary night watch to determine origin. The request was not immediately granted. But by the beginning of June, it was clear that the quarry was no longer regarded as merely producing unusual echoes. Something within the sealed pit was generating sound with intention or, at least, with troubling consistency. And those who had once dismissed it as wind began to arrive not to disprove it, but to listen. The night watch at Crewthorne Pit began on June 6, 1906. Company management did not assign a full crew. The expense was considered unnecessary. Instead, Thomas Elwick was authorized to remain on site after dark for 3 consecutive nights, accompanied by 1 additional man. Samuel Rudd volunteered without hesitation. Arthur Bell, though not formally assigned, was permitted to remain nearby with lantern equipment and note-taking materials. They established their watch from a small tool shed overlooking the winding path that descended toward the lower tunnel entrance. From that position, both the upper fencing and the gate could be reached quickly, while still allowing the men shelter from the damp night air that settled heavily inside the quarry bowl. The first night passed without incident. The second produced only brief, uncertain murmurs near midnight, too faint to record with confidence. It was the third night, June 8th, that later accounts would return to repeatedly. Weather records from Leeds confirmed that evening as unusually still. Barometric pressure had risen sharply. The sky remained overcast, holding the darkness low over the landscape. Several witnesses later remarked that sound seemed to travel farther than usual across the surrounding fields. Elwick and Rudd began their watch shortly after 9 o'clock. Bell positioned himself near the upper fence with a hooded lantern and a small pocket notebook. The men agreed that if the sound occurred, they would note the time precisely and attempt to determine whether it originated from the shaft or the lower tunnel. For nearly 2 hours, nothing disturbed the quiet. At approximately 11:15, Bell heard it first. He later described the beginning not as a sound, but as a sensation of faint vibration that he felt through the wooden fence rail where his hand rested. Moments later, the murmur rose from the shaft below him. Unlike previous occurrences, it did not build gradually. It emerged already layered and continuous, as though several conversations had been underway before reaching the surface. Bell signaled with the lantern. Elwick and Rudd ascended the path quickly and joined him at the upper fence. All 3 men later agreed that the sound was stronger than on any previous occasion. It rose steadily from the darkness below, neither echoing nor breaking into separate reflections along the stone walls. It remained concentrated, almost directional, as though emanating from a fixed point within the pit. Bell attempted to record the rhythm of the tones in his notebook, marking short lines and pauses in uneven succession. He later stated that the pattern suggested multiple speakers, though no single voice could be isolated. After nearly 1 minute, Elwick made a decision that neither Rudd nor Bell later claimed to have suggested. He instructed them to accompany him to the lower gate while the sound continued. The descent was hurried but careful. Loose gravel along the winding path shifted under their boots. The murmur remained audible throughout the descent, though it altered slightly in quality, becoming deeper, less diffused. By the time they reached the tunnel entrance, the sound seemed to be emerging directly from within the blocked corridor beyond the iron bars. Rudd carried the lantern forward, holding it high so the light extended between the bars and into the narrow passage. The beam revealed nothing unusual. The rubble remained undisturbed. Moisture glistened along the stone floor. The bend in the tunnel swallowed the light exactly as it always had. The sound continued. Elwick stepped closer than he had during any previous inspection. He placed both hands against the iron bars and leaned forward, angling his head toward the opening. According to Beale's later account, this was the moment the sound changed most dramatically. The layered murmur faltered and had ceased, but fractured, as though the overlapping tones had broken into separate fragments. For several seconds, the men reported hearing intervals of near silence between brief, low utterances. Then came what Rudd would describe, many years later, as the only moment he believed he understood something. He never claimed to hear a full word. He insisted only that the cadence resembled direct, address, short, deliberate, and singular. Bell later wrote that Elwick stiffened suddenly, though he did not withdraw from the bars immediately. Instead, he asked a question. Very quietly, "What do you want?" Neither Rudd nor Bell could later confirm why he chose those words. Both men insisted he spoke them without raising his voice, almost as one might speak to a person standing just beyond sight. The silence that followed was immediate and complete, not gradual, not fading. The sound stopped in a manner that all three men later described as unnatural in its abruptness. Elwick remained motionless for several seconds. Then he stepped backward, releasing the bars. Rudd lowered the lantern slightly, as though uncertain whether to keep the light trained on the tunnel or withdraw it entirely. They waited. No sound returned. Bell recorded the time as 11:23. The men conducted a full inspection of the gate. The bolt remained secure. The lock showed no marks. The surrounding stonework bore no sign of recent disturbance. They checked the slope above the tunnel entrance for evidence of hidden access. None was found. The watch continued until nearly 2 in the morning. Nothing else occurred. Yet those who knew Elwick noted a change in him when they returned to the cottages before dawn. He did not discuss what had happened. He did not enter a detailed account in the maintenance ledger. The following morning, he wrote only a single sentence beneath the previous entries. Sound observed at length during night watch. No source located. Arthur Bell, however, added something to his private journal that same day. A passage not shown to the Quarry Company and not mentioned publicly until years later. Mr. Elwick said, while walking back, that it did not seem like an echo at all. He said it behaved as though it had been waiting for us to be quiet. Within a week of the night watch, Elwick requested reassignment away from inspection duties at Crewthorne Pit. He did not give a formal reason, and although the quarry remained sealed, the men who had stood at its gate began, one by one, to avoid approaching it after dark. Thomas Elwick's reassignment was approved on June 15, 1906. Officially, the change was attributed to health considerations and the need for experienced oversight at another active quarry 2 miles north. No mention was made of the night watch or the repeated reports of sound. The company ledger simply reflects a shift in duties. Yet among the men of Crowthorne, the reassignment was understood differently. Elwick had worked that pit for more than 25 years. He had survived cabins flooding and a winter rockslide that nearly crushed him beneath falling stone. He was not known for timidity. His decision to step away from inspection duties carried weight. Samuel Rudd continued the rounds, though less frequently. Arthur Bell was instructed to accompany him only during daylight hours. The suggestion of another night watch was not raised again. In the weeks that followed, the occurrences did not cease entirely. they diminished. The sounds were reported twice more in late June, once by Rudd alone during a mid-afternoon inspection, and once by a farm laborer crossing the ridge at dusk. Neither account carried the intensity of the June 8th event. Both described the murmur as faint and short-lived, yet the psychological effect lingered. Rudd later admitted, in a conversation recorded by a parish curate in 1912, that he found himself listening for the sound even when far from the quarry. At night, he said, one grows accustomed to expecting it. Arthur Bell's journal entries from that period reveal a similar unease. His handwriting becomes tighter, more compressed. He writes of dreams in which he stands at the lower gate, unable to determine whether the murmur originates from within the tunnel or from behind him on the path. Notably, none of the men claimed to see anything unusual. There were no lights in the shaft, no figures along the rim, no disturbances to the rubble blocking the corridor. The phenomenon remained confined to sound. In early July, the Quarry Company took a quiet step that appears only in internal correspondence. They ordered additional rubble to be deposited inside the lower tunnel entrance, effectively sealing the passage more thoroughly behind the iron gate. The work was conducted in daylight, with 3 laborers under supervision. According to the foreman's report, no cavities or hidden chambers were discovered within reachable distance of the entrance. The passage was solidly obstructed within 15 feet of the gate. After this reinforcement, reports of sound became rarer. One final entry appears in the maintenance ledger dated July 19th, inspected site following additional sealing. No further disturbance noted. There are no more references to interior noise in the company's official documents after that date. Yet the matter did not end entirely. Within the cottages, the quarry remained a topic of subdued conversation. The widows who had once stood at the fence declined to walk that path again. Children were warned away not only because of unstable ground, but because it unsettled the men. Arthur Bell left Crewthorne in September of that year to seek work in Sheffield. In his final journal entry regarding the pit, he wrote, "I do not think it meant harm, but I cannot say what it was that we heard." Samuel Rudd remained in the district for the rest of his life. He seldom spoke of the matter openly. When pressed, he repeated the same cautious explanation offered at the outset, that limestone formations can conduct wind in peculiar ways. Yet those who knew him well remarked that he never again approached the lower gate alone. As for Thomas Elwick, he continued quarry work elsewhere for another 12 years. He never returned to Crowthorne Pit. The site itself gradually faded into disuse. Weeds overtook the winding path. The fence posts weathered. The iron gate rusted but remained intact. By the early 1920s, few remembered the precise details of that spring. Only that, for a brief period, in 1906, a sealed quarry long, abandoned and officially empty, had seemed, on certain evenings, not empty at all. By the time the First World War began, Crowthorne Pit had already slipped from public notice. The fence posts leaned. The warning board rotted at its edges. The winding path was no longer clear enough for carts. Sheep wandered near the rim without hesitation. Whatever attention the quarry had drawn in 1906 did not extend into the following decade. What remains of the matter survives only in fragments. The company maintenance ledger, preserved in partial form, contains 4 entries referring to interior sound. The wording is restrained. There is no speculation, no dramatic phrasing, only dates, brief descriptions, and the repeated confirmation that the gate remained secure. Arthur Bell's journal surfaced in 1931 after his death in Sheffield. A nephew donated several notebooks to a local historical society. Among ordinary entries about wages and weather, there are 7 pages concerning Crewthorne Pit. His tone is not sensational. He expresses uncertainty more than fear. He never claims certainty that the sounds were voices only, that they behaved as though formed. Samuel Rudd gave a short statement in 1912 to a parish curate, compiling local histories. In it, he emphasized natural explanations. "Quarries speak," he said. "Stone carries wind and memory of work. One hears what one expects." Yet in the same statement, he acknowledged something more difficult to dismiss. It answered, "When we were still." Thomas Elwick left no written account beyond the ledger. However, a single recollection appears in an oral history, recorded in the 1940s by an elderly resident who claimed to have spoken with him years after the event. According to that resident, Elwick once remarked, "It was not the sound that troubled me. It was the stopping." No geological survey conducted in later decades reported unusual acoustic properties specific to Crewthorne Pit. Limestone formations are known to amplify and distort airflow. Temperature inversions can bend sound from distant farms or roads. Multiple voices carried on wind may merge into indistinct murmur. Such explanations are reasonable, yet none fully address the detail repeated across independent accounts. That the sound often ceased the moment someone approached the gate. In 1924, the Quarry site was partially filled during a land reclamation effort. The lower tunnel was permanently buried. The upper shaft was reduced to a shallow depression, fenced once more for livestock safety. No further reports of interior sound were recorded after that time. Today, little marks the location except a subtle dip in the pasture west of Leeds. Walkers crossing the field would not know that a deep limestone cut once stood there, nor that men once gathered at its rim to listen into darkness. There are no monuments, no plaques, no formal inquiry, only ledger lines, journal pages, a few cautious sentences in a parish record. The men involved did not claim ghosts. They did not describe apparitions or figures in the pit. They reported only sound layered, patterned, and, at times, responsive. Whether those tones were the natural language of wind moving through abandoned stone, or something shaped by the expectations of men who had worked too long beneath the earth, was never determined. What remains is quieter than speculation. For several weeks in the spring of 1906, a quarry long sealed and officially empty produced a murmur that drew men to its edge. They listened. It listened back. And then, without announcement or explanation, it stopped.